Proton 11.0-2 is now in release candidate testing, and for some Linux gamers that is immediately useful. Valve is listing fixes for games that would not launch, problems with controllers, awkward Wayland and NVIDIA behavior, and a few SteamOS specific rough edges. But a release candidate is not an instruction to update every game in your library and hope for the best. The useful question is more practical. Does this build solve a problem you actually have, and can you test it without breaking a game that already works? That matters whether you are on a Steam Deck, an AMD desktop, or an NVIDIA system running Wayland. A patch that fixes a black screen after suspend is valuable if you see that black screen. A controller hot plug fix is valuable if your controller is the thing getting in the way. And if none of those problems sound familiar, staying on the stable branch may be the sensible choice. Valve describes 11.0-2 as a release candidate. In plain English, that means it is close enough to test, but the final content is not locked. The change list can move, and Valve specifically wants reports about issues that are new compared with Proton 11.0-1. So this is not going to be a long reading of every line in a changelog. We are going to sort the fixes into the things you will notice. Games that launch again, controllers that behave, graphics and video issues that stop getting in the way, and the Steam Deck or desktop cases where the update is actually worth trying. Then I will show you the save workflow. Not the set it globally and cross your fingers workflow, the per game approach that lets you test one title, keep a record of what changed, and go straight back to your known good version if the result is worse. There are 3 questions worth answering before you touch that beta branch. First, what is the difference between stable, experimental, hotfix, and a release candidate? Second, which of the fixes could matter for your hardware? And third, why is Valve asking you to compare a problem with 11.0-1 before calling it a regression? The third one sounds a little dull, but it is the part that separates a useful bug report from a support thread mystery. And the answer also tells you exactly how cautiously you should approach this release. Before we look at the individual fixes, there is one distinction that prevents a lot of confusion. Proton 11.0-2 is not replacing Proton as a whole. It is one build in a set of tools that Steam may use differently from game to game. Most of the confusion around the Proton update comes from treating every label in Steam as if it means the same thing. It does not. Stable, experimental, hotfix, and release candidate are related, but they are useful at different moments. Start with the stable build. This is the sensible default when your game is working and you do not have a specific reason to change anything. It is the version you want as a reference point, because if a newer test build causes trouble, you need somewhere reliable to go back to. Then there is Proton Experimental. This is where Valve can deliver game-specific work more quickly. If a game update breaks something on Linux, Experimental may receive a fix before it becomes part of a broadly released build. That can be useful, but it also means it is not the place to expect maximum consistency from every title in your library. Hotfix is even more targeted. Think of it as a quick response for a particular problem. Steam can apply it to a specific game when Valve has a narrow compatibility issue to address. You might benefit from it without ever deliberately selecting it, especially on a Steam Deck, where game-specific choices are often handled for you. And now we have the Proton 11.0/2 release candidate. Valve's own notes are unusually clear here. This is a build for testing, and the listed changes are still tentative. The point is not to prove that it is perfect. The point is to help identify whether the changes are ready to become the next stable release. That wording tells us how to use the build responsibly. If a game is currently fine on 11.0/1, there is no price for moving it to the release candidate today. Test when a listed fix overlaps with a problem you actually have, or when you are willing to spend a few minutes verifying that the game still behaves normally. If a game is broken on 11.0/1, the release candidate is a reasonable thing to try. But do it per game. Write down the version you were using, make one change at a time, and test the exact behavior that failed before. Does the title launch? Does the controller reconnect? Does the game survive, suspend, and resume? Does the issue reappear when you return to the previous version? That last comparison is not bureaucracy. Valve asked for it because an issue that already exists on 11.0/1 is not a new regression in 11.0/2. Separating those two cases saves developers time and gives you a clearer answer about what the update changed. Here's the practical rule. Stable is for playing, experimental and hotfix are for targeted compatibility needs. And the release candidate is for controlled testing. Once you see those as separate jobs, the next question becomes much easier. Which fixes in this build are likely to matter on your particular machine? A large Proton changelog can look impressive while telling you almost nothing about whether you should care. The useful way to read this one is by outcome, not by the number of game names on the page. Valve lists several titles as newly playable in the 11.0-2 release candidate notes. It also lists fixes for games that stopped launching after an update or titles that had black screen behavior. And a collection of controller, full screen, suspend and graphics issues. The first group is launch and loading failures. Valve addressed problems affecting titles like Diablo 4 and Helldivers 2. The important wording is Valve says. That does not mean every combination of GPU and desktop will behave identically. It means there is a specific reason to retest if one of those titles has been broken for you. The second group is presentation problems. Black screens after Alt-Tab or strange low-resolution behavior can be frustrating. The notes include examples involving full-screen input, high-resolution display modes, and ray tracing loads. The third group is basic usability. Controllers reconnecting correctly, audio surviving device changes, and SteamOS wake behavior. These are the fixes you notice only when they are missing, because they interrupt an otherwise ordinary gaming session. Valve also updated pieces underneath Proton like DXVK, VKD3D, Wine Mono, and FEX. These are important, but not a promise of a universal boost, and may only affect a particular hardware path. So do not ask how many fixes are there. Ask, is my game or my display mode on that list? If yes, this is a sensible test. Next, we unpack Wayland and NVIDIA. Subscribe for more technical deep dives. For Steam Deck owners, compatibility is not just about whether a game reaches the menu. It is about whether it still works after you put the device to sleep, whether the controller is recognized the way you expect, and whether the game feels like a console experience instead of a troubleshooting project. Valve's release candidate notes include a few fixes that land directly in that territory. There is a fix for Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Remastered input when full screen is used on SteamOS. Valve also lists a fix for Forza Horizon 6 auto-closing after suspend and resume on recent SteamOS versions. And it says controller hot plug reliability has improved, alongside a fix for Rocket League incorrectly identifying a replugged DualShock 4 or DualSense controller as an additional device. Those are not glamorous benchmark claims. They are better than that. They are session-saving fixes. A game that closes when you resume a handheld is not reliable, even if its frame rate is excellent. A controller that appears as a second player is not a minor inconvenience if you're sitting down to play with a limited amount of time. There is also a useful distinction here. Some of these improvements may already have reached the game through Proton Experimental or Hotfix. Valve says that many of the 11.0-2 changes were deployed on a game-by-game basis before arriving in this release candidate cycle. So a Steam Deck user may not see a dramatic overnight change in every game. That is not a sign that the update failed. It is a reminder that Steam can apply compatibility work selectively. If you want to test this properly on a deck, choose one title where you have a repeatable problem. Do not start with a game that has been flawless for months. If you have had a controller reconnect issue, reproduce it. If suspend has been closing the game, put the system to sleep and wake it again. If full screen input has been unreliable, change exactly that setting and check the same scenario. And keep the test small. You do not need a weekend-long compatibility study. You need a before and after answer. On the old version, the issue happens. On 11.0-2, it does not, or it still does. That is already useful to you, and it is valuable information if you decide to report the result. For desktop gamers, the same principle applies, but the symptoms can be different. A desktop has more variables: driver versions, display servers, multiple monitors, higher resolution panels, docks, external controllers, and sometimes NVIDIA-specific behavior. That is where the next set of release notes becomes more interesting, because it explains why. Works on Steam Deck is not always the same as works on my Linux PC. Linux gaming on a desktop has improved quickly, but it is still the place where the details matter most. Your desktop environment, GPU driver, display server, monitor layout, and game settings can all influence what a Proton fix looks like in practice. The 11.0-2 release candidate notes include 2 entries that are worth calling out. Valve says it fixed No Limits 2 displaying incorrectly on NVIDIA GPUs under Wayland. It also says it fixed Vagante freezing at character selection on setups using Wayland with NVIDIA GPUs. Those are specific fixes for specific situations, not a general declaration that every Wayland and NVIDIA issue is solved. That careful wording matters. Wayland is not one single configuration. GNOME and KDE have different compositors and defaults. NVIDIA driver behavior can change across releases. A 2-monitor setup can expose problems that never appear on a handheld. And some games have their own ideas about full screen, overlay handling, resolution changes, or input focus. For the desktop gamer, the useful takeaway is not switch to Wayland because Proton 11.0-2 exists. The useful takeaway is that if you already use Wayland and have one of the kinds of failures Valve lists, freezing, odd rendering, wrong colors, or a game that breaks on a particular display path, this is a release candidate worth trying per game. Before changing Proton, document the basics. Which desktop environment are you using? Which session? Wayland or X11? What graphics driver version is installed? Is the problem tied to full screen, a second monitor, a specific controller, or a particular in-game setting? You do not need to publish that information online just to test it. But writing it down prevents you from changing 3 things at once and then guessing which one helped. There is one more desktop fix in the list that makes this point nicely. Valve says a number of games no longer fail to start when the Steam client is set to a non-English locale. That is another reminder that the difference between a working and broken game can be a system-level detail that most changelogs do not explain. This is also where it helps to resist over-testing. Do not turn every evening into a driver experiment. Pick the problem you are trying to solve. Make a clean note of your baseline. Test the release candidate. Then either keep it because it helps or revert because it does not. Linux gaming becomes much calmer when updates are treated as controlled changes rather than an all-or-nothing upgrade ritual. And that brings us to a question every desktop gamer eventually asks. If the release candidate contains all these small fixes, is there a performance win hiding in there? The answer is more nuanced than a chart with one number, and it is worth getting right. This is the point where a Proton release can be misunderstood. A new DXVK build, an updated VKD 3D component, or a line about a rendering fix can sound like a performance announcement. Sometimes a game does improve, but Proton 11.0-2 is not a universal framerate patch, and presenting it that way would set the wrong expectation. Proton is a compatibility layer with many moving parts. A fix may stop a game from hanging when ray tracing is enabled. It may correct the way a launcher renders. It may make video playback work again. It may repair a controller path, an alt-tab issue, or an audio problem after sleep. Those are real improvements, but they do not add up to one number that applies to every game and every PC. That is why I would not test this release candidate by launching a favorite game, seeing the same frame rate and declaring it pointless. Test the problem it claims to solve. If you had a black screen after alt-tab, alt-tab. If a game did not start after its latest update, try the same start path. If the controller was duplicated after reconnecting, reproduce that exact sequence. A clean test has 3 ingredients. First, a known baseline. Second, one change at a time. Third, a result you can repeat. The more precisely you do that, the more confidence you can have in the answer, and the less likely you are to attribute a random good session to the wrong update. By the way, I just checked our channel analytics, and it turns out about 83% of you watching right now are not subscribed yet. If these practical Linux gaming deep dives are useful, subscribing is the best free way to support the channel and make sure you do not miss the next one. There is another reason to avoid benchmark theater. You may already be benefiting from some of these fixes. Valve says that most, if not all, of the listed changes previously went out through Proton Experimental or Hotfix on a game-by-game basis. In other words, the release candidate is partly about consolidating and stabilizing work, not necessarily revealing a completely new capability on every device. So if your game already works, that is good news, not a failure of the update. Stay on the stable branch unless you have a reason to test. If your game does not work or you recognize one of the listed issues, then the release candidate becomes a focused option. Next, we can make that option concrete. I will walk through the safest way to select it for one game, test it, and return to the version you trust if the result is not what you hoped for. Chapter 7 of 12. The Safe per Game Test. Here's the process I recommend for testing Proton 11.0-2 without turning your whole Steam library into an experiment. First, choose one game. Preferably, choose the game where you recognize a problem from Valve's notes. A failed launch, an input issue, a crash after resume, a black screen, or a graphics problem. If you only want to see whether the release candidate is interesting, choose a title you can launch quickly and that has a repeatable scenario. Second, record your baseline. That does not need to be complicated. Write down the current Proton version, the issue you are seeing, your GPU, and whether you are on Steam Deck, AMD, or NVIDIA. If the issue is related to a particular action, write that down too. For example, after waking from sleep, this game closes. Or, after reconnecting the DualSense controller, Steam sees a second device. Third, select the release candidate branch for the Proton 11.0 application in your Steam library. Valve's own instructions point you to Proton 11.0, then Properties, then Betas, where the release candidate option is available for testing. Remember that the build name shown elsewhere in Steam may not update in the way you expect. That is why the branch selection is more useful evidence than staring at a version label. Fourth, apply Proton 11.0 to the selected game only. The exact Steam selection interface must be captured from a real client in the final edit. Do not use a generated settings screen. The concept is simple. This one title uses the version you want to test, while the rest of your library stays untouched. Fifth, run the same test you used for the baseline. Do not introduce a new graphics driver, a new desktop session, and a new in-game setting at the same time. If you do, you may get a better result, but no useful idea why it happened. Then take a moment to check the boring things. Does the game start twice in a row? Does audio still work? Does the overlay behave? Does the controller connect as expected? Can you Alt-Tab, suspend, or change display modes if that was part of the original issue? A release candidate earns your trust through repeatability, not one lucky launch. If the result is better, keep the test branch assigned to that game and make a note. If the result is worse, or simply different in a bad way, return to the version you used before. That reversal is not a failure. It is exactly why a per-game test is safer than a global change. Once you have done this once, rollback becomes the easy part. And the details of that rollback are important enough to make explicit. Because a good test always includes a clean exit. The best thing about testing Proton per game is that going back is straightforward. You are not committing your whole operating system to a beta. You are changing one compatibility tool for one title, which means you can undo the choice when you need to. If the release candidate does not help, return the game to its earlier Proton selection. If you were using the default stable path, remove the force compatibility selection or choose the prior known good option. Then run the same test again. If the old behavior returns, you have a useful comparison. If the problem remains, the release candidate may not be the cause or the solution. That comparison is exactly what Valve asks for in its release candidate notes. When reporting a problem, Valve wants to know whether the issue is new to the 11.0-2 release candidate build, or whether it also happens on 11.0-1, which is the non-beta branch for Proton 11.0. That is a sensible dividing line. A regression needs a different investigation from a long-standing problem. A useful report is not a novel. It is a compact set of facts someone else can act on. Name the game, state the exact Proton version or branch, State your distribution, desktop session, GPU, and driver. Explain the action that triggers the failure. Say what you expected and what happened instead. And, importantly, say whether 11.0-1 works. If you have a game log or a crash report, attach it only when the reporting path asks for it, and only after removing anything sensitive. But do not assume a giant wall of output makes a report better. A reproducible sequence is usually more valuable than 10 pages of unrelated diagnostics. There is also a social benefit to doing this properly. Release candidates are one of the few moments where a regular Linux gamer can help shape the stable experience without compiling anything or becoming a full-time tester. You are not expected to solve the bug. You are giving the developers a reliable before and after result. If you do not have a problem, you do not need to invent one. Enjoy the stable build. If you do have one, test narrowly, report clearly, and roll back when the evidence says you should. That leaves one final technical thread from the release notes: the component updates. Vex, DexVec, VKD3D, and Wine Mono are names that often get treated as magic words. They are not magic, but understanding what they do makes a changelog much less mysterious. Subscribe for the final breakdown.
The bottom of a Proton changelog often looks like alphabet soup. Vex, DXVK, VKD3D, DXVK NVIP, Wine Mono. It is tempting to skip over it, but these pieces explain why one game can be fixed without a visible setting changing anywhere in Steam. Start with Proton itself. It is the compatibility layer that helps Windows games run on Linux and SteamOS. Under that umbrella, different tools translate different parts of what a game expects from Windows into something Linux, graphics drivers, and system libraries can handle. DXVK is one of the important pieces for games using Direct3D 9, 10, or 11. It translates those graphics calls into Vulkan. VKD 3D Proton handles Direct3D 12 work. If a component update fixes a path, a black screen or visual glitch simply disappears. Wine Mono helps with Doornet style launchers, while Vex matters for a more specialized case, running x86 applications on ARM64 Linux. Proton 11.0-2 also includes updated versions of these components. The technical detail is useful for troubleshooting, but it is not the headline. The headline is still the practical behavior. Can the game launch, render correctly, accept input and survive actual use? A massive technical change can do nothing for your favorite game. A tiny input fix can make a game suddenly usable again. Do not judge by that. Do not judge by the number of updates. Treat ProtonDB as a lead for testing, not as a substitute. It cannot guarantee results for your specific driver, controller, or mods. With that context, we can turn the changelog into a more useful decision. Which player should try this now, and what is the smallest reliable test?
Chapter 10 of 12. Who should test Proton 11.0-2 right now? At this point, the answer should be more specific than everyone who uses Linux. Proton 11.0-2 is a good candidate for some people to test today. For others, the most sensible move is to stay on the stable path and let the release process do its job. You should consider testing the release candidate if you have a game with a problem Valve explicitly lists. That might be a launch failure after a game update, controller behavior that changed after reconnecting a device, a black screen or rendering issue tied to your setup, a suspend and resume failure on SteamOS, or one of the titles Valve says is now playable. You should probably wait if your library is working well, you do not have a repeatable issue, or you simply want the least amount of maintenance possible. Stable is not boring in a negative sense. Stable is what lets you spend your gaming time playing instead of comparing branches. Steam Deck users have a slightly different calculation. If the problem is around suspend, input, or a specific title that Valve names, testing can be quite reasonable because the configuration is relatively consistent. If you use a desktop with multiple monitors, a custom controller setup, a non-default desktop environment, or NVIDIA under Wayland, testing can still be worthwhile, but document your baseline first, because there are more variables. For AMD desktop users, the main question is often whether a particular game, display mode, or controller path has improved. For NVIDIA desktop users, pay closer attention to the Wayland-specific entries. Not because NVIDIA systems are inherently unreliable, but because the affected graphics and compositor paths can vary more from one setup to another. And if you are using Linux on ARM hardware, the FEX update may be interesting, but it is not a broad recommendation without a reason to test. As always, start with a real use case rather than a curiosity-driven global change. There is one group that should avoid treating this video as a reason to switch platforms. People who rely on games with anti-cheat or online service limitations that Proton has not addressed. A newer Proton build does not override a developer's anti-cheat policy. Before buying a game or making a major migration decision, verify current compatibility through official game information and carefully labeled community reports. If you're on a Test Now group, the last 2 chapters will give you a compact test plan and a short list of the release notes most worth tracking. If you are in the Wait group, you will still know exactly what to look for when 11.0-2 becomes stable. Chapter 11 of 12. A 15-minute test matrix that tells you something. You do not need a laboratory to get a useful result from Proton 11.0-2. You need a small, repeatable test matched to the kind of system you use. Give yourself 15 minutes per game, not an entire weekend of changing settings. For a Steam Deck, start with one of 3 paths. If the issue is input, launch the game with the controller already paired, then repeat after disconnecting and reconnecting it. If the issue is suspend, reach the same in-game location, put the deck to sleep, wake it, and check whether the game resumes cleanly. If the issue is launch behavior, start the game twice from a cold Steam session. You are looking for consistency, not a single successful attempt. Illustrative test plan. Launch twice, reconnect, and sleep/wake. For an AMD desktop, use the problem you already have. If you have an Alt/Tab or full screen issue, use the same monitor and the same game settings both before and after the change. If you have a controller issue, repeat the same connection sequence. If you have a rendering problem, go to the same save game location where it appears. Do not alter Mesa, the kernel, or the desktop session during the test, unless that is what you are deliberately testing. We test the handheld, AMD, and NVIDIA setups one at a time. For an NVIDIA desktop, add one more line to your notes. Are you running Wayland or X11? The release notes have specific Wayland and NVIDIA entries, so that context matters. Test your known failure on the same session, with the same monitor arrangement and graphics settings. If the problem goes away on the release candidate, test once more after a restart before calling it fixed. For all 3 setups, write the outcome in one sentence. Launches twice now. Controller reconnects without a duplicate device. Still freezes after resume, no difference. Those sentences are enough to decide whether you keep the release candidate for that game. If you want to go a little deeper, note whether the Steam overlay works, whether audio is correct, and whether your expected display mode is still available. These are not random extras. They are commonplaces, where a compatibility change can trade one symptom for another. A quality check strip for launch, input, audio, and display. The point is not to produce a universal verdict on Proton 11.0-2. Your test is not a review lab, and it does not need to be. The point is to answer a much better question. Does it improve this game on this system with this problem? Once you have the answer, your choice is easy. Keep it for that title if it helps, revert if it does not. And if you hit a genuine new regression, report it with the baseline comparison Valve asked for. That is the entire workflow. Clear, reversible, and far less intimidating than the changelog makes it sound. There is just one final piece, the short version of what this release candidate changes, what it does not change, and the exact action I would take depending on your setup. So, should you install Proton 11.0-2? If you're looking for a blanket yes, the honest answer is no. It is a release candidate. Valve says the changelog is still tentative, and that is exactly why the safest approach is to test it only where you have a reason. If a game in your library has one of the problems Valve lists, a launch failure after an update, controller trouble, or a SteamOS suspend issue, a Wayland and NVIDIA glitch, a black screen, or an audio and video problem, then Proton 11.0-2 is worth trying on that one title. Keep the baseline, make one change, repeat the test. Keep it if it improves the result, and revert if it does not. The official Valve release candidate proof explains that this build is for testing and that 11.0.1 is the comparison branch. If your games already work, stay on stable and enjoy them. Many of the fixes in this release cycle may already have been delivered through Proton Experimental or Hotfix for particular titles. You do not need to chase a new number to have a good Linux gaming experience. The bigger picture is encouraging, but it is not magic. Proton 11.0-2 is another collection of practical compatibility work. Games that launch again, controller and display quirks that get repaired, and a set of improvements. Moving through a careful release process. The value is not that every title suddenly becomes perfect. The value is that specific rough edges are being narrowed, one reproducible issue at a time. This abstract compatibility path shows the real goal. A smooth bridge from your library to your Linux system. And that is the test worth remembering. Do not ask whether the changelog is long. Ask whether it contains your problem. If it does, you now have a safe way to find out whether the fix applies to your system. If you found this useful, like the video, subscribe and sign up for the weekly newsletter at tondoeslinux.com/subscribe. It helps more people find practical Linux coverage without the hype. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks, consider clicking the join button below to become a pseudo user or get root access.